Hello, my name is Paula Irizanu, and today we're discussing with Peter Pomerantsev about his books, about propaganda, and about his work in Ukraine, in Russia, in the US, and across the world. You were born in Kiev, and you like to say that you only threw up over the Soviet Union before leaving with your parents at 9 months old.
I also shat on it.
Not the important thing to do as a baby, and then you lived in Germany and in the UK, and you returned to the region, but you went to Russia to work as a TV producer, and you also wrote your first book there, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. And you started to be associated internationally with Russia rather than Ukraine, given the kind of subject matter of your first book. But of course, now you're traveling to Ukraine a lot, and right now you're just coming from there. You're working on documenting war crimes in Ukraine, and you're also learning Ukrainian. How has the war in Ukraine transformed your identity? Because we in Moldova and around the world have been witnesses to how Ukrainians have embraced learning Ukrainian and speaking Ukrainian more, and they have kind of been forced to kind of rethink who they are, given this full-scale invasion of Russia.
So my parents are bilingual, like most people from Ukraine, and my grandparents, even on my father's side, who are from Odessa and Kharkiv, they worked in Ukrainian because they were part of the Ukrainianization of Ukraine in the 1920s. But my parents spoke Russian at home, and I grew up in London. I never lived in the Soviet Union. And my parents switched to Ukrainian for their for their public and some of their social life after the full-scale invasion. And I turned to them and I said, like, why didn't you teach me Ukrainian? Because we all spoke Russian at home. And they said, you were so stupid that we barely managed to teach you one foreign language. And so now I'm doing catch up and learning Ukrainian. But in terms of, look, I'm British, and it's the only passport I have. I live in America now. I'm very British when I'm in America. But all my childhood, I tell people I was from Kiev. People were very curious where I was from. There weren't many people from the Soviet Union in London. And I'd say I'm from Kiev, and they'd say, oh, Kiev, Russia. And I didn't struggle with it very much. I just went, yeah, whatever. And then I think actually it was around in 2014, and somebody was, I was at some conference, and they kind of insisted on saying that, like, I'm of Russian heritage, and at that point I realized, no, this has to stop. I mean, it just, before you could just sort of like wave it off and not really care. I mean, then in retrospect I should have, but there was just too much of a tide all around one to start picking fights over it. But from 14 I started going, look, this is a political thing now. It's very, very important to get this right. So I started being much more insistent. And I went on a little bit of a journey of trying to make sense of what this meant, because, Ukraine was somewhat of an abstraction for me. I'd never lived there. In Russia, I'd spent 9 years. I didn't feel an identity connection with it. And my book is very much written from the point of view of a foreigner, but I knew it. Ukraine, I didn't really know. I'd go to Kiev, I'd go to Chernovitz to see relatives, but I'd never known it. Also, I'm from even my father is, according to a Soviet passport, Ukrainian. I'm very much from a Jewish family. So my understanding of that region was through the Jewish history. When my father was arrested by the KGB, it was for human rights and handing out copies of Russian language literature. He wasn't arrested for Ukrainian language work, which got you a much longer prison sentence. Yeah, so a lot of his friends were arrested that way. He wasn't. He wrote poetry and in Russian. So even in the Soviet Union, you were defined by the paragraph that you were arrested by. The cause of arrest was what defined you, rather than anything else, I think. And he was arrested for illegal literature, not for kind of nationalism or which was a much different kind of arrest. So these things are very important. You know, you come from the Soviet Union. What were you arrested for?
Yeah, it makes me think of the Moldovan writer Tatiana Țibulac. She said you can create an identity out of something that has been stolen from you, not just out of something that you have. And now you're adding to that list. You can...
Exactly. So my father was arrested for literature generally, for world literature, for Russian language literature that was banned, and so like that was kind of more my world. While his friends were Ukrainian nationalist dissidents, were arrested under a different charge and given much longer sentences. So anyway, coming back to this, so my relationship with Ukraine was kind of abstract, and I started going there a lot with more intent. Really, only after 2014, so already very grown up, and so in my 30s, and it was a revelation. It was a revelation because I realized that I mean, all my family's from Ukraine. I realized that what I always thought were sort of various kind of family quirks were actually rooted in places. So I went to Kharkiv a lot, and my granny's from Kharkiv, or near Kharkiv, and realized that so much of her coquettishness, frankly, is everywhere in Kharkiv. It's a way of like the way sort of women sort of look you up and down when you're in Kharkiv is the way she would look men up and down. And I was just stunned. Like I had no idea that actually her behavior was typical from where she came from. And then I went to Chernivtsi, where my father was from, and you know his whole idea of a kind of cosmopolitanism, very much rooted in Chernivtsi, which was a city that, you know, always spoke in 4, 5, 6 languages, and his relationship with Austro-Hungarian literature is very much sort of founded in growing up in a completely Austro-Hungarian town. And then my mother's from Kiev, and it's probably the strongest thing, her taste in aesthetics, in food, but also most specifically how she'd always looked for places for us to live in Munich and then in London that were actually, I now realized, a lot like Kiev. You know, a very similar dynamic of space and parks. I mean, if you know Kiev, it's it's a sort of a city that's based within a park or a park within a city. It's very hard to tell them apart. She'd always look for that wherever she went. So aesthetically, I'd grown up with all these Kievian motifs. And so, you know, and my grandfather was from Odessa. I mean, that's a very easy one to connect to if you have a lot of Jewish history. But I suddenly realized that everything that I thought was just my family was actually made up of bits of Ukraine. And that was revelatory, because when something is an abstraction, you know, obviously my family was always pro-Ukrainian independence, very pro the creation of a kind of like of a language-based community as well. You know, they largely supported all the language reforms. But that's not me, you know. So I had to go there and start finding these very, very personal things, and then it all came alive for me. And I mean, it's always somewhere where I felt completely at ease, especially in Kiev, and especially in Kiev, ever since I started coming there as a student. And I don't know if that's, maybe it's just a city where everybody feels at ease, or maybe it's a personal thing. I don't know. But I'm very, so I have been very informed by Ukraine without necessarily realizing it. But look, I'm very much a creature of London, and very much of a corner of London, which is actually, if I'm very honest, the only place I feel at home in the world. But it's been wonderful discovering the subtle, not just saying I'm Ukrainian heritage, but actually working out the connections and working out how you are actually made up of this, you know, not culture and abstract, but these very, very specific habits and behaviors and ironies and humors and tastes and aesthetic notes. And that makes your life a lot richer. I mean, if you're a kind of an endless immigrant or emigre like me, when you realize it's not some sort of abstraction called Ukraine, but actually very specific streets and places, and ways of women looking at men, then you feel much richer. So that was nice. So it's been a lovely experience, and I remember having a massive disagreement on the eve of the invasion with a leading DC expert on the region, who, like me, was born in Kiev but grew up in the US. And we had a really quite unpleasant fight. I think both of us were very tense because the invasion was coming. And I was like, I feel this sort of incredible connection to the place, and he was like, oh, that's because you're immature, and why should we be defined where you were born as an accident? Do you seriously think that the accident where you were born defines anything? And I'm American now, and I like my Ukrainian background means nothing to me.
Has he changed since then?
I have no idea. I should go and ask. Don't really try to communicate with him too much. But it was interesting. And I came away going, I think you're losing something. You don't know who you are. You don't know who you are because you don't dare to explore the complexity of where you come from.
And you've explored the complexity of Ukraine through your work as well. Since 2013-14, you were saying that you've been engaging with the Ukrainian past and doing some kind of sociological research. And I was curious if you could expand a little bit on that, on how, what kind of relationship to the past people have in the areas in which you've worked.
Yeah. So look, the focus of my research at the London School of Economics and at Johns Hopkins is usually, it's been changed the last 2 years a little bit, but I'm going to very much go back to what I was always doing, which is trying to think about how we can improve journalism, storytelling, documentaries, media in the broader sense, by understanding audiences better and in the context of information war. So the Russians use history to divide Ukraine traditionally by saying that, Ukraine is betraying the traditions of World War II, Ukraine isn't respecting the Soviet legacy. There are a lot of cliches about people in the southeast of the country being Soviet nostalgics and being very, very vulnerable to this sort of propaganda. And so, we did a lot of research with Ukrainian partners, understanding how do people really feel about the past. And essentially we found that beneath the veneer of nostalgia, many actually had these reserves of late Soviet trauma. Obvious things like Chernobyl, where they'd been treated terribly and had ended up with sort of like, with terrible medical conditions and just had been treated very badly by the government, by the Soviet government. But also things like the Afghan war, nobody talked about it. Actually, everyone had a relative who'd served there and come back or not come back in a very bad way. All sorts of stuff that people have forgotten about, like Soviet repression of small businesses. And a lot of the people in Southeast Ukraine are small businessmen. So there are all these stories about the late Soviet period which were just not being told, which when you started to raise them, made people less attached to their nostalgia. I don't think people stopped being nostalgic because I think that's something very, very personal. A bit like my stuff about like my Ukrainian past. It's you can't really climb into that personal stuff. But that's kind of up to people if they have personal memories or whatever. But you do want them to get into a place where they don't want that for the future. Yeah, so it gave a kind of like, we'd show people the films and we'd ask them questions, and it was clear that you could actually undermine the political manipulation of the nostalgia. Yeah, because at the end of the day, most of the people in that region wanted what they called a European future. And that's not a Soviet one, and that's not one that Moscow can offer. I was just in Odessa actually on the way here, and there's always these debates about Odessa and its past, and the statues, and it's a city with a complicated past, but not with a complicated future. For the Odessa self-identity, which is all about being in cosmopolitan ports and business, and not always legal business, but that kind of image of itself, that's only possible in a democratic Ukraine. That's not possible in authoritarian Russia. So it's just so easy once you actually start, not easy, it's all less impossible than it can seem when you look at the power of Russian propaganda to actually start to move people to a different paradigm.
But over the past 2 years, you said you've changed your focus, and I assume that part of that focus is documenting your work, war crimes in Ukraine. And I was wondering if you could kind of explain to us step by step what exactly that means. How does one document a kind of Russian war crime in Ukraine?
Yeah, so look, I'm still doing my sort of propaganda research, but just not in Ukraine. That didn't seem relevant in Ukraine because the nation was pretty united. Now it's changing. Now I think it's worth starting again. But we kind of put that on pause. I continue doing that kind of research into audiences in a lot of other places, but not in Ukraine. So in Ukraine, been very much focused on, but again, it's how do you, look, I'm always informed by the question, how do you make what you and I do, the whole bouquet of communication, how do you make it work for democracy? So I essentially think the old model is not quite working. This idea that you put out good information, and if it's good information, people will choose it, and it will influence legal processes, and it'll play this role in democracy, which is kind of the completely unsubstantiated assumption that media work on, that we have this place within democracy and political meaning and public opinion. And frankly, I don't think it's accurate. I think we need to go back and think about what on earth are we doing? What is this job that we're doing? And one of the ways to think about this, or one of the aspects, is holding evil people to account. So this idea that we would just do a story about some war crime and that would help bring legal accountability is a very, very tenuous approach and very flimsy and just not very focused. So we wanted to see, okay, how can we connect research into war crimes, collecting the evidence, writing about it with effect? And very simply, what I helped create with a couple of colleagues was an NGO that brings together journalists and lawyers. So we have around, depending on the project, 12 to 24 Ukrainian journalists who have been trained in the basics of international humanitarian human rights law. So that when they're doing their stories, and they're still doing stories, they're still journalists, they're also collecting evidence. They're collecting it in a way that's both good for legal courts and for journalism, which is hard. It's a very different interview approach, but it's still an interview approach. But they have these long questionnaires, the level of detail you need to get is very different. The sorts of people you interview is much broader. So we have them collecting the evidence, usually on theme. So we'll do 9 months just on child deportations, or we've just done a project on indoctrination. And then that kind of archive goes to two places. It goes to our legal team, which is in Berlin and London, which starts to build cases and legal submissions out of it. And then it goes to sort of like our editorial team, which I help lead, which thinks about, okay, where do we put these stories? Where do we have the most impact? Ideally, they come together. Ideally, we'll choose a jurisdiction we want to act in. For example, we've done a lot of work in Argentina. And we do a bunch of stories in Argentina, which takes a lot of editorial work because it's not that easy to get Argentine people to care. And at the same time, we're doing the legal work. So how can we put it together for a combined effect? Yeah. So basically, I just think we have to start thinking in more effective networks.
More different ways of collaborating between different kind of industries.
To get to an effect. Now, that's obviously a big move away from the classic idea of journalism as just giving information and then like these sort of high priests of truth moving away. But I don't find that satisfying anymore. I'm not saying people shouldn't play the role of high priests of truth. Let them do that. We probably need some priests in our broken world, but I don't think that's going to get results. And I just think we're in a world where you have to be so much more, frankly, aggressive about effects.
And more creative.
more creative. It's all about networks. It's all about putting things together and to get somewhere. I just don't think the theory of change of I said something and it'll change the world is good enough when there's so many things being said. It's just too busy to have an effect.
Do you still come across, or do you still think about how you communicate with people who believe that it's Kiev's fault or it's NATO's fault for what's happening
So doing a lot of
in
work,
Ukraine?
Yeah, do a bunch of work in Russia, did a bit in Germany, doing a lot of research in America.
How do you communicate with these people? What do you think? What has been an effective way of engaging with them in your experience?
So I have quite a dark view of human nature, basically, and I believe if people are saying these things, it's motivated. They have a psychological reason or a corruption reason, frankly. They want to do corrupt business with Russia and they're looking for an excuse, or they have some sort of motivated psychological reason. I don't really believe in people being duped and people being, I was confused by disinformation. I think people choose the disinformation they want in order to do what they want. So I don't think, I'm sure there are some audience who are different, who are just confused and whatever. But generally, it's really understanding. If you want to change, if you want to fight for these people, it's often about changing the subject onto something they really care about. Finding something they care more about more than the reason that they had to believe in the disinformation.
Can you give examples?
So it's often about changing the subject.
So start talking about food that they grew up with, or
yeah, for example, you find the vulnerable. So let's take Russia. When the Russian government puts out the stories about NATO, they work quite well. Yeah, because it's not about NATO, it's about an enemy is coming to us. That always works. That works in any country. Yeah, that's fear, that's togetherness. The NATO thing, no one's having a historical debate about NATO. You can do a campaign saying that NATO is a defensive organization. It's not about that. No one is competing in a debate about NATO. Yeah, NATO is the word that's being used in order to talk about fear. We need to be together. That is incredibly hard to break. That's why it works quite well. Yeah, there's an outside enemy that is threatening us in a world that is genuinely threatening. In a world where you've started a war, so yes, someone's going to probably come for you. So fighting that is going to be really, really hard. So yeah, you find the vulnerabilities. You have to think about the effect. Don't think about the topic. These things are not a debate about the truth where you can win a debate. Nobody's having like an intellectual debate with you. They're pressing that button to get an effect. The effect is to bring the nation together and to unite them under Putin. That's the point of that. So what you're looking for is how do you break that effect? You want to disunite them and get them distance from Putin. So you find the issues where they don't trust their propaganda and you work on those. So it can be about food. It's often about self-interest. That is true. But self-interest isn't something that we should look down on. Self-interest is also about agency. Self-interest can also be the beginnings of a democratic stirring because people don't trust their government. They want to do things themselves. So yeah, the issues where the Russians are in trouble domestically are all the issues to do with inflation, stability of the ruble. They just don't believe the propaganda on that, short-term loans, there's all these things that they don't, the relationship with China, and there's all these things where they do not trust the propaganda, and so you focus on that. Because you're focusing on effect. You're focusing you have to always ask, what is the aim they're trying to do, and try to disrupt that aim. So I think we get lost. I think it's a little bit like, but going back to the history project I talked about, the Russians were trying to use various types of historical propaganda not to win a debate about propaganda. Yeah, it didn't help that you could sort of argue with them about that more Ukrainians died in World War II than Russians or whatever. They didn't care about that. They were trying to use people's sense of discomfort with their lives in Ukraine and giving them some way to kind of some sort of words to fill that discomfort. So you have to sort of focus on that, or conspiracy theories. We did a lot of research into why people believe conspiracy theories, and it's got nothing to do with the conspiracy theories. The conspiracy theories change, but they play into people's sense that they have no agency, that somebody somewhere is manipulating them. So the way to battle it is not to disprove the conspiracy theory. Yeah, it's to understand the psychological need for it, which you counter by media that helps give people a sense of agency and ownership. Yeah, so they stop thinking I'm being manipulated to go, okay, I'm in control, I can change things. So you think about the effects, you think about the psychological needs that propaganda fills, and you work on them. And the words, NATO, Soros conspiracy, whatever, all that stuff, you sort of got to just not get distracted by that.
So, for instance, what do you mean? How do you give them that sense of ownership by pressing on the subjects where they?
No, so the ownership thing. Look, I think the way to go, and I think the way to go is to start thinking about media less as an information source and more as a social service. So, how do we create media that understands, that listens to the agendas people care about, and then helps them deal with them? Yeah. So start thinking of yourself as a social service. Yeah. What is the role of information in helping people deal with the problems that they have, and how can we help them do something about that? Tabloid newspapers have always been really good at this. Find a topic and then lead a campaign on it, that sort of thing. Yeah. But making people feel very involved in that process. So again, the opposite of objective journalism, which always floats above and talks down. And again, I'm not saying there's no role for that. That can be very, very important. But I'm saying that that's not going to help defeat conspiracy theories. If you want to help defeat them, you have to go to the psychological roots. So it's that kind of stuff.
So it sounds a bit like therapy on a big scale, if you're using, I don't know, the kind of right tools, but it also sounds like propaganda if you're using the kind of tools that.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the ways I compare it is the difference between a therapist and a cult leader. So if you think about what we call propagandists, but let's be more specific, authoritarian propagandists, yeah, are doing is they will find people's vulnerabilities, the society's vulnerabilities, their feelings of discomfort, feeling unrecognized, unheard. And instead of helping people change that in a fundamental way, they will, like a cult leader, say, I see your fear, I see your pain. They'll wiggle it, they'll make it worse, which is what a cult leader does. They'll humiliate them a little bit more and then say, I'm the solution to it. Follow me, only I'm the solution. You need me as a way to deal with all these problems. You cannot deal with them yourself. You need me. That's how authoritarian propaganda works, yeah? The examples are all around us. Democratic propaganda, if we're going to call it that, is going to do the opposite, yeah? It's going to say, here's the issues, it's going to also recognize the traumas, recognize the reservoirs of dissatisfaction, and it's going to say, okay, how do we bring this into speech, and how do we start solving this together? How do we empower you to deal with it? Which, yeah, if we're going to use the therapy comparison, is the difference between a therapist and a cult leader, who do the same thing. Both of them try to find out your weak spots. Both of you get you to open up, but then one helps you to become free, and the other one makes you their slave.
One empowers you and the other one disempowers you. And I can see a kind of red thread throughout your life and your career and
oh my,
your
now
interest.
You sound like a therapist. So having listened to you for 3 weeks here, I think I can see. Yeah.
No, I was just thinking about the experiences that led to your first book, your TV work for Tanta. And the kind of the vision of that channel of trying to kind of create a more liberal Russia. And I was wondering whether you felt at the time, I guess you do talk about it in your book as well, but how do you see it now? Did you feel like there was this fine line between propaganda and kind of content creation or entertainment or storytelling that you were treading on, or that wasn't something that was on your mind?
Oh no, totally. That I went and wrote a book about it. Look, I think we have to stop being scared of this word propaganda, which is kind of a neutral word with a bad reputation. Large media, part of their job is to create a forum for society to have a metaphor for itself and sometimes change. So you can do that in very horrible, manipulative ways. You can do it in more open ways, but that is actually that's one of its main roles. And certainly when the BBC was being created, that is exactly how it was thought of. How do we create this sort of metaphor or metonymy, I guess, for society? A way for society to imagine itself, to discuss its problems, change, deal with them, etc. I mean, that's, if we think of a nation as an imagined community, it imagines itself in its media, especially in its sort of large-scale media.
So like a mirror?
Huh?
Like a mirror?
No, it's more than that, isn't it? It's not really a mirror because you're taking types. It's more like avatars. Even a debate show, we have different types, each of which is meant to represent different bits of society. It's a way for society to imagine itself through representatives. I mean, it does that politically through elected representatives, but here it's sort of like our representation of ourselves. So it's much more than a mirror, but it's where we become. I mean, you can't hold a mirror up to a society; it's too big. So you've got to sort of shrink it to the level of a sitcom. So no, I think that's the great power of mass media, and always was. I mean, so TNT, the channel I worked with, were trying to normalize LGBT people in Russian life. So a lot of the people who worked there were from the LGBT community, and they really wanted to change that. And so they just started introducing LGBT characters in their shows who weren't stigmatized as much. They're still stigmatized, but in a harmless way. That was, I think, a big success. Or they changed the role of women. They had all these empowered women in their shows. Again, it was both a market thing. They wanted to ride that wave. They could see there were more empowered women in society, but they also wanted to promote it. So that's why it's such a fascinating profession, a fascinating job. But they weren't using conspiracy theories or fear or nasty things. They were drawing people in a very open way into saying, we want to change the image of gay people in society.
And that aligned with your values
listen,
well. Mm-hmm.
So when I came to Russia, I came in 2001, 2004. I started working with Russian media. 2005, I can't remember now. 2006 maybe even. But like and at that point, so Putin had already started putting pressure on the TV channels. So if you were like from a nice family, you weren't working in TV current affairs anymore. So everyone had fled, all the sort of people, liberal-minded people had fled to the glossy magazines and to the entertainment TV channel. So they still had complete freedom. Nobody touched you. So there was an incredible concentration of talent in those places because people who would have been doing, I don't know, large-scale documentaries about history didn't want to do that anymore because it was already a little bit strange. I mean, this is 2005, 2006. I'm not talking about 2014. Already then, with very few exceptions, it was, if you could afford it, you would not work in current affairs. So it was a specific type of person who went and worked in them already. So no, I was in this bubble of people, all of whom have since left Russia, obviously. I don't think anybody stayed there.
Would you still call Russia postmodern dictatorship, a term you used in your first book?
I think in a way even more so. In the sense that there wasn't really a dictatorship then, but now it clearly is. So I think even more so. But it's still. But look, I mean, firstly, I haven't lived there for a while, so I don't know what language I'd use now. But it's. I mean, the main debate now is to what extent is it fully totalitarian yet? I can't tell. I'm not there.
But
It
what
certainly aims to be fully totalitarian. I mean, it's doing youth group. I mean, if totalitarian is trying to embrace every bit of your life, it certainly seems to be doing a lot more of that. When I lived there, they didn't get involved at all in your personal life. I mean, you could just live in an immigration completely away from the state. Now that's I think much harder, but they still clearly leave a lot of space for people to almost forget about the state when they live in sort of the big cities. So they still create these spaces of denial if you really want it, but you just got to try really hard to be in denial.
So they're still trying to confuse people and not necessarily get to believe the Kremlin, but to not believe in anyone and kind of live in this
I think
post-truth.
I think they might. I mean, I'm less focused on the emotional side of living in Russia these days, in the sense that I'm not there. I think you actually have to be somewhere to talk to people. I can tell what they're doing in their propaganda. The people's everyday experience is harder for me to ascertain. I haven't been there for 10 years now, so I'm very careful on that. I expect it to sort of change less than we think. But they always had one big problem. For many reasons, they didn't push motivational propaganda very much. The propaganda they pushed was about confusing people, making them passive so they didn't protest. So they didn't feel that they could change anything through the use of confusion and conspiracy theories and this kind of dissuasion. They get very worried when people start becoming too agitated. But then they had a problem with mobilization. So they tried to create youth groups. They basically failed. Yeah? Because you can't have both. Either you're doing a kind of like, a revved up society full of high expectations, or you're doing a completely passive one. And when they needed to mobilize society around the war, literally to go and die, where you definitely need mobilization, it failed totally. Yeah. So if anything, and given that choice, they decided to keep it passive, and then mobilization is done through money, through all types of different mechanisms. But that doesn't seem to work very, very well. This idea that they could mobilize society to go to war. No, they have to pay them, force them, bribe them, punish them. Because when given the choice, these completely passive people fled, like 1 million or so fled. We know they're passive because as soon as they get outside, they don't protest. Mm-hmm. They don't form like huge anti-Putin movements, which they would if they were passionate. They just don't want to be, they're the ideal Putin citizen. They don't, to the extent they don't want to be part of Putin's wars, which is the ideal. I mean, this is the problem when you create these passive people. So that's always been their problem. And I remember one of their spin doctors, Gleb Pavlovsky, who's now dead, who was a former dissident who kind of decided to work for Putin. And he was very open about this. He was like, our biggest problem is motivation. So we're very good at the other bit. We're very good at sort of spinning these worlds around people, but we have a crisis in motivation.
But at the same time, two questions come to my mind. One is the way that kind of nothing is true and everything is possible vision of the world comes through Russian propaganda in Moldova as well. So it's not just targeting citizens within its borders, but also people within its kind of former sphere of influence.
Yeah.
And I've met actual people who said, we'll learn about what's actually happening in Ukraine years from now because it's all so confusing. And I understand that now you don't believe that this can be a position that people can actually kind of hold innocently, that there may be some sort of psychological mechanism at play there for why people hold on to that idea. And then the other question that I'd like to lead to is that you said that authoritarian propaganda has been quite effective, whereas liberal kind of visions of the world, or propaganda, if one is not kind of adverse to this word, has been less kind of effective in the past few decades, that we haven't had strong stories that liberals have told. Is there a story that liberals can tell now that is very powerful, that you'd like to be pushed?
So this is like a deeper issue. So firstly, in terms of the authoritarian, model versus the liberal model, R1 was based on a bunch of assumptions that have fallen apart. About pluralism leading to good debate, about freedom of speech leading to better information. That's all fallen apart. We didn't need to compete with them because we thought we had a model. Like always, like the EU, we thought we'd set the rules, which would just make democracy better, and the rules have exploded. So we aren't doing anything, really, to compete. And that goes all the way from sort of like, inside democracies and other places as well. Now, in terms of the story, I mean, there's not one story, of course, but the authoritarian story at the moment is very, very powerful. What do I mean by that? I mean, we're going through a period of huge flux, like we did in the early 20th century. There's a lot of echoes. Identities are under threat. Ways of life are under threat. Economic stability is under threat. Genders are under threat. All this, this huge swirl, which some of us find exciting, many others find deeply, deeply disorientating. And in that swirl, a propaganda that says you're losing everything is under threat, resonates very deeply. Something of ours is being taken away, resonates very deeply because people feel deeply insecure already. Yeah? So this idea that I will bring stability, it's all the fault of them, the immigrants, whoever, appeals very deeply. Here's your clear roles in this confusing world, appeals very deeply. And you can then, you can take that psychological need and extrapolate it to geopolitics, to everything. And they do that very effectively. Now, I actually don't know what the response should be. I'd like to spend a lot more time with theatre directors and script writers and start thinking about it. What do you do? I mean, if the great liberal story of ever more freedom, ever more equality, the story of 1989, has become confused and blurred and contradictory in many ways, do we then have to work with that feeling of insecurity people have, but just develop it in other ways? What is the true relationship between freedom and security? What is the other way of security? And that translates to many things, to many political things. We're still thinking about things as liberal versus conservative, left versus right. Should we just be looking at different types of right? Maybe we're just even using the wrong lens to look at any of this. Should there be different ways of negotiating the confusion? If the confusion is there and it's deep and it reaches so many people, what are the other ways of working with it? So my instinct would start with that. How do we, if everybody feels as if they're coming apart in so many ways, what are the other ways of working with that? Because so far the authoritarians are dominating that feeling. They're dominating that feeling and they're dominating that territory, and we're not competing in that space. So I don't know. I'd love to talk to people who think about storytelling in more deep ways than journalists.
And in your latest book, How to Win an Information War: The Propagandist Who Fooled Hitler. I'm retranslating the title from Romanian into English. You did actually look at a time when democracies were fighting against authoritarianism as well.
Yeah.
And you discovered a character, Sefton Delmer, who was a journalist, but then started working with British intelligence to undermine Hitler's propaganda in Germany, the country he grew up in. You said that you're a kind of permanent emigre yourself. How how did you discover his story, and did you identify with him from
Yeah.
the beginning?
So this is my most personal book, which may have been a mistake, because in my other books, I use myself as the narrator, but in a very, very disciplined way. They're not about me at all. I was actually very, very strict with myself in my first two books because I was so worried about using myself as the narrator, and I didn't want to seem self-indulgent. And I was very conscious that I am, to quote Isherwood, I am the camera. I am just an avatar for the reader, and there is just enough about me in the first two books to get the reader to latch onto something. But there's nothing about my family life in my first book. It's a memoir with nothing about the fact I gave birth to 3 kids when I was there. It's obviously by far and away the most important thing in my life. It's not even mentioned, So none of my first 2 books are memoirs in the sense that there's anything personal in them. Yeah.
You do have some family stories of your parents.
In my second one,
your
exactly,
second
but
book,
using
yeah.
them purely as a metaphor. Well, not a metaphor, a way to explore how media has changed. There's nothing about their love relationship. It's all, if you look at it, and I was so strict about that because having grown up in England, I'm embarrassed talking about myself. I don't like American memoirs when they tip into just telling you about that. I'm like, even some of my favorite American authors do this. They slip into suddenly telling me about their personal lives. Like, I don't care. This has stopped being a parable about something bigger than yourself. This is now about you, and that is self-indulgence and lazy. So this book is the first time I've actually talked about myself much more, but through the character. So I'm not present in the book, there's much less me in this book than before, but there is much more of myself in it. And I still don't know whether the reader forgives me that. I feel how dare I? But
How did you come across him?
So Sefton Delmer, I came across him as actually an example of something I didn't want to write about. So he to the extent that he's remembered, and he was a very famous person in his own day. He was the most famous British foreign correspondent in the 1920s, like the superstar, like Tintin, a mixture of Tintin and Borat, because he was famous for sort of disguising himself and doing this sort of pranks, like, getting into a Nazi rally as if he was a leading Nazi and that sort of thing. So he was a mixture of Tintin and Borat. He was very famous in his own day, and then he led Britain's. He was head of special operations for the political warfare executive. So he was running at different times between 10 and 20, if not more, radio stations, newspapers, leaflets, this whole empire of counter-propaganda based out of a very beautiful country house in Bedfordshire. So he was a famous man. His memoirs were a huge deal when he wrote them. He was on TV. He was kind of a star of journalism in the World War II in his day, and now is completely forgotten. And the reason he's forgotten is because what he did was basically use disinformation, black propaganda, and all the nasty tricks we associate with Goebbels and Putin against them. And after he died, nobody really wanted to remember that because maybe it was necessary, but we don't, World War II was meant to be our finest hour. And it's the other side that does sneaky disinformation and all these horrible things. And I got to know him as somebody, I'd go to conferences, people would talk about him, and he was remembered as that. There's once every 10 years, somebody makes a documentary about him on British TV. And it's always from that point of view. It's like Britain's secret pornographer. He used a lot of pornography, really quite spectacular pornography, in order to do these sort of porn shows about corrupt Nazis having these orgies in a lot of detail.
Did you have to watch that as research for your book?
So he made radio stations.
Did you have to listen them? Or?
So one of the reasons I got interested was when I realized that even though we don't have the radio shows anymore, it was Second World War, we have the transcripts of all the shows. So I was like, okay, that's interesting.
So you read pornography?
I read a lot of pornography over COVID. This was very much a COVID book. I mean, I'm not a historian, so this was my one time to get to know the archive. So yeah, I read a lot of porn. And it's really quite spectacular porn. I mean, it's more comedy, but pretty intense and gruesome with, a lot of Nazi generals doing really quite explicit things with their helmets and a lot of butter and a lot of boys and girls. And a lot of sadomasochistic details. So anyway, he was using all this stuff and spreading these sort of nasty stories about Goering and all this kind of like, especially essentially doing sort of like, you know, these sort of stories of smearing the Nazis, yeah. And that was relatively interesting, but not something I really wanted to write a book about. So because it's funny that we did it. It asks you a lot about questions about, like, you know, who really owns this information and black propaganda? Is it really the other side, or is it us as well? But in terms of technique, I was like, you know, big deal, you know. But then I started reading his memoirs, and something there jumped out at me, which made me go, actually, there's something more interesting going on. So look, essentially, Delma created stations that pretended to be Nazi stations, but were full of kind of upset Nazi soldiers complaining about Hitler and Goebbels, and down to sort of very, very low level sort of officers, very, very specific, to kind of destroy confidence in the army and destroy their reputation. And the way I'd understood it always was that Germans were meant to think that these were real Nazi stations. So like the Russians now will create a Twitter handle that pretends to be an American, you know, complaining about, you know, Hillary Clinton or Kamala Harris.
Yeah, we've just had the spokesperson for the government today talk about all of these new Brittanies and all of these kind of English names that were coming supposedly from Moldovans complaining about their government. So
yeah,
clearly,
exactly.
like,
so just, you know, just masked propaganda. I mean, really not as a phenomenon important to deal with, as a psychological trick, not very interesting. But there was something he wrote in his memoir which made me think there's something else going on. And basically he said that he wanted the Germans to know it was British dressed up as Nazis. So he wasn't trying to deceive people. He wanted them to know this was the British wearing a mask. And then I was like, well, that's weird. Why do you want them to know? And essentially what he was saying was that it's a sort of psychological jujitsu. He wanted people to feel safe listening to this. He wanted to give them a mask under which they could tell the truth and criticize their own regime in psychological safety.
And trust.
He wanted to create a community where people, like in a masquerade, where everyone's sort of wearing a mask and can thus actually be more themselves. And also, like, psychologically, he wanted to show, look, how easy it is to imitate the language of the Nazis. And if it's that easy to imitate, do you really need the people who originally created it? Look, we can do the same thing as them, express the same violent emotions as them, except we're telling stuff which undermines them, which is in your interest, not their interest. And that's sort of almost through an echo effect, undermining the original. And when I kind of read about that and started thinking about that, I was like, whoa, this is something way more complicated than standard Russian disinformation going on. He's actually fascinated in the way we identify with propaganda and the way it gives us a community to be in, roles to perform. And he's sort of saying there seems to be other ways of having a relationship with media. So then I went and read his early memoirs. I started to become interested in him as a person. And you'll have to read the book, but really he has a very personal relationship with propaganda. He grew up in different countries, a bit like me. He grew up in Germany and England. He was very aware of propaganda giving people roles, like social media does today, giving people communities to be in. Propaganda as being about identity and forming identity. And you could form different sorts of identity with it. You could form an identity that was very pretended to be blindly believing in something and following it, or something which was much more ironic, distanced, but ultimately self-empowering. You'll have to read the book to get into the details of it. He was actually doing something incredibly subtle and incredibly, I think, personal for him. But I think gets to a universal and eternal truth about how the essence of propaganda is giving people satisfying roles to play in a confusing world. And the trick is not that we ever become ourselves We're always playing roles. That's fine. But the trick is, are they roles that you are playing because they suit Hitler, the leader? Are you following somebody else's play? Or can you take control of your own life and be the director of your own life? I'm jumping over a lot of stages, but that's what he was playing with, yeah? Which goes back to what we were saying earlier about sort of propaganda as a cult, where you give yourself up to Putin or to Hitler or to anyone else and seek to live through them and thus become their slave. Emotionally satisfying, but totally disempowering. Or do you start to take control of your own life, and can media help you to do that? Now, he was doing that for war aims, yeah? He wanted people to undermine the Nazi machine from inside through different things, through sabotaging boats or just not going to Nazi rallies or undermining the Nazi economy. But they were all about getting people to separate themselves from the Nazi play and start becoming actors who define their own lives. Anyway, so once I was just fascinated by his deep understanding of what propaganda is really about, and his attempts to work in that space while doing something incredibly concrete. I mean, he's not I've made him sound like a theoretician. He's not. He doesn't write theory. He's trying to get soldiers to defect from the front, or trying to, get German citizens to give up a town. I mean, he's doing something incredibly concrete, but with this deep understanding of human motivation and the role of propaganda. So I ended up writing a book.
So, Madame Bovary, c'est moi. Sefton Delmer, it's you.
So I've never understood what Flaubert meant by that. I mean, he's so critical of Madame Bovary. What does that mean, Madame? I've never understood that phrase, because everywhere else he's scathing of her. I mean, she's this sort of ditzy woman who lives in total delusions and doesn't see the reality in front of her.
I guess as an author, it's like you identify with all of the characters that populate your books, or there's something of you in all of your characters.
Well, I'm definitely Sefton Delmer, but why? Yeah. I mean, that's not controversial. But why is Flaubert Madame Bovary? I mean, like,
that's the question.
I mean, like it's no. I've always heard that phrase, and I was like, no. I mean, like, I see nothing in common between them at all. Or he hates himself, and that he sees himself as a ditzy, as an irresponsible person who betrays all that's important in their lives in order to follow a fantasy that doesn't exist.
Or maybe, that's something that he's always wanted to do but never had the courage to.
Okay, well, I think this is now about Flaubert, so I don't know.
Well, thank you very much, Peter Pomerantsev.
Thank you.